If you've ever tried to practice English by yourself and felt like you were getting nowhere, I need you to stick with me for the next hour, because I'm about to explain exactly why that happened, and exactly what to do instead. Here's the problem almost every solo learner runs into. You sit down, you open an app, you scroll through some vocabulary, maybe watch a video, close your laptop an hour later, and nothing really changes. Weeks pass. Months pass. You can still read fine, you can still understand a decent amount, but the moment you have to actually speak or write something that matters, you freeze up exactly the same way you did 6 months ago. And the worst part is, you start blaming yourself. You think maybe I just don't have what it takes, or maybe I need a teacher, because clearly I can't do this on my own. That belief is wrong, and it's costing you time you'll never get back. You absolutely can improve your English on your own, without a classroom, without a tutor, without spending money on courses. But there's a catch: almost everything people typically do when they practice alone isn't actually practice at all. It's passive consumption disguised as practice. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through the real difference, and give you a complete, honest system for practicing English alone that actually produces results you can feel and measure. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to structure your speaking practice without a conversation partner, how to turn listening into an active skill instead of background noise, how to use writing to fix mistakes you don't even know you're making, and how to build a weekly routine you can actually stick to, even with a busy schedule. This isn't going to be a video with 5 generic tips you've already heard 100 times. I'm going to go deep into the why behind each method, the exact way to execute it, and the mistakes that quietly sabotage most self-learners without them ever realizing it. So settle in, because we've got a lot to cover. Why most solo practice doesn't actually work. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. Most of what people call practicing English alone is actually just consuming English. There's a massive difference between the two, and understanding that difference is the single most important shift you need to make before anything else in this video will work for you. Consuming English means watching a show with subtitles, scrolling through an app, reading an article, listening to a podcast in the background while doing something else. Your brain receives input, sure, but it's not being pushed to produce anything. It's not being pushed to retrieve information under any kind of pressure. It's comfortable, low effort, and honestly, kind of relaxing, which is exactly why so many people mistake it for real practice. It feels productive because you're doing something in English, but feeling productive and actually building a skill are two very different things. Real practice, on the other hand, requires production. It requires your brain to retrieve a word, construct a sentence, correct itself, and adjust all in real time, under some kind of constraint, whether that's time pressure, accuracy pressure, or the discomfort of hearing your own voice say something wrong. This is uncomfortable by nature. And that discomfort is actually the signal that learning is happening. If a study session feels completely effortless and pleasant the whole way through, there's a good chance very little skill building actually occurred. Here's an analogy that might make this click. Imagine someone who wants to get better at basketball. They watch hours of NBA games every week, they read articles about shooting form, they even download an app that quizzes them on basketball rules. After 6 months, are they going to be a better basketball player? Obviously not unless they've actually been on a court, dribbling, shooting, missing shots, and adjusting their form based on what went wrong. Watching basketball builds basketball knowledge. Playing basketball builds basketball skill. Language works exactly the same way. This is why so many people who've watched hundreds of hours of English language content over the years still struggle to hold a basic conversation. Their comprehension might be genuinely strong, they understand plenty of what they hear and read, but comprehension and production are two separate skills that live in different parts of the process. You can understand a language extremely well and still be unable to produce it fluently, because production requires active retrieval, not passive recognition. So the first big mental shift you need to make is this: practicing alone doesn't mean spending time around English. It means deliberately creating situations where you're forced to produce it, speak it, write it, retrieve it, even when there's no other person there to force that out of you. That's the entire theme of everything I'm about to walk you through. The mindset shift from consumer to practitioner. Before we get into specific techniques, I want to spend a few minutes on mindset, because without this, even the best techniques will fall apart within a couple of weeks. Most people who study alone treat English learning like binge-watching a series. They consume it passively when they feel like it, they skip days without much guilt, and there's no clear structure to what they're doing beyond exposure. The problem with this mindset is that skill building requires consistency and intention, not just accumulated hours of contact with the language. Think of yourself less like a student sitting in a lecture, absorbing information, and more like an athlete in a personal training program. An athlete doesn't just spend time near a gym. They have a plan. They know what muscle group they're working on today, they track whether they're getting stronger, and they push themselves slightly past their comfort zone in every session, because that's where actual adaptation happens. Language learning follows the same logic. Comfortable repetition of things you already know doesn't build new skill, it just reinforces what's already there. Real growth happens at the edge of your ability, where you're stretching to say something slightly beyond what feels easy, and either succeeding through effort or failing and immediately correcting yourself. This zone is sometimes called the productive struggle zone, and almost every effective solo practice method we'll cover in this video is designed to put you inside that zone on purpose. There's another important mindset shift here too. Stop waiting to feel ready before you try to produce the language. A huge number of solo learners spend years in what I call the preparation loop, endlessly learning more vocabulary, more grammar rules, more listening input, telling themselves they'll start actually speaking once they know enough. But fluency isn't something you accumulate and then unlock. It's something you build through the act of speaking itself, badly and imperfectly, over and over, until it becomes less bad and less imperfect. You don't get to skip the awkward stage. Nobody does. The only path through it is through it. And finally, give yourself permission to make mistakes loudly and often when you're practicing alone. This might sound obvious, but a surprising number of solo learners still practice in a hushed, embarrassed way, even when nobody's around to hear them. That quiet, self-conscious practice produces weak results, because the whole point of active production is committing fully, speaking at a normal volume, forming complete sentences, and actually trying, rather than half-heartedly muttering something and moving on. Nobody's watching. Use that freedom. The 4 pillars of solo practice, an overview. Before diving deep into each one, I want to give you the big picture of what effective solo English practice actually consists of. There are 4 core pillars: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Most people who study alone lean heavily into just 1 or 2 of these, usually listening and reading, since they're the easiest to do passively. And almost completely neglect speaking and writing, since those require active production and feel far more uncomfortable. This imbalance is exactly why so many people end up with what's sometimes called receptive fluency, the ability to understand a lot without being able to produce much. If you only ever consume and never produce, your receptive skills will keep improving while your productive skills stay frozen in place, sometimes for years. Speaking alone means training your mouth, your rhythm, and your real-time sentence construction, without needing a conversation partner. This is the pillar most solo learners neglect the most, and it's the one we'll spend the most time on in this video, because it's genuinely the hardest to simulate alone, but also the most trainable, if you know the right techniques. Listening alone means training your ear to catch not just general meaning, but specific sounds, structures, and natural speech patterns, including the messy, fast, contracted way native speakers actually talk, not the slow, clean textbook version. Reading alone means engaging with text in a way that builds both vocabulary and a feel for natural sentence construction, rather than just decoding meaning and moving on. Writing alone means using written production to expose the gaps in your grammar and vocabulary that you can't easily notice when you're just speaking, because writing gives you time to actually see your own mistakes on the page. The strongest solo practice routines weave all four of these together throughout the week, rather than obsessing over just one. In the sections that follow, I'll walk you through specific, concrete techniques for each pillar. Techniques you can literally start using tonight. Speaking practice: how to train your mouth without a partner. Let's start with the pillar people struggle with the most: speaking practice when there's no one else to talk to. This feels like the hardest thing to simulate alone, but it's actually one of the most trainable, once you understand the underlying techniques professional language learners and interpreters have used for decades. Technique 1: Shadowing. Shadowing means listening to a short piece of native audio. A sentence or two from a podcast, show, or video and speaking along with it almost simultaneously, imitating the rhythm, stress, and pronunciation as closely as you can. This trains your mouth to physically produce the sounds and rhythms of natural English, not just your brain to understand meaning. Do this with short clips, 5 to 10 seconds long, and repeat the same clip several times in a row before moving to the next one. This builds automatic, reflexive pronunciation and rhythm that reading alone can never give you. Technique 2: Self-narration. Throughout your day, narrate what you're doing out loud in English in real time. I'm making coffee now. I'm looking for my keys. I can't find them anywhere, this is so annoying. This might feel strange at first, especially if someone might overhear you, but it's one of the most powerful ways to force real-time sentence construction under natural conditions, because you're describing things happening right now, without any script to fall back on. Start with simple, concrete actions, and as you get more comfortable, expand into narrating your opinions, plans, and feelings, not just physical actions. Technique 3: The 1-minute monologue. Pick a topic. Anything: your weekend, a movie you watched, your opinion on something in the news. Set a timer for 1 minute, and speak continuously without stopping, even if you make mistakes or have to pause awkwardly. The goal here isn't perfection, it's building your ability to keep going despite hesitation, which is exactly what real conversation demands. Record yourself doing this, and you'll have a valuable byproduct, a recording you can review later to catch patterns in your own mistakes. Technique 4: Answering imaginary interview questions. Write down or find online a list of common interview or conversation questions. Tell me about yourself, what's a challenge you've overcome, what are your goals for this year, and answer them out loud, as if someone were actually asking you. This trains a specific and very useful skill: producing longer, structured spoken answers on demand, which is exactly the kind of speaking most real conversations and interviews actually require. Technique 5: Role-play both sides of a conversation. This sounds unusual, but it's remarkably effective. Pick a common scenario: ordering food, negotiating a price, asking for directions, making small talk with a coworker, and speak both parts of the conversation yourself, out loud, switching between the two roles. This trains you to anticipate what a native speaker might actually say back to you, which is something passive listening never teaches you, because in passive listening, you're never the one who has to respond. Technique 6: Voice memos as a running journal. Instead of writing a journal, record a daily voice memo, 1 to 3 minutes long, talking about your day, your thoughts, anything on your mind. Over weeks and months, you'll build up a library of recordings you can go back and listen to, and the difference in fluency between your earliest and most recent recordings will be one of the most motivating things you can experience as a solo learner, because it's undeniable, concrete proof of progress. A quick but important note on all of these: volume and commitment matter enormously. Mumbling quietly under your breath produces far weaker results than actually speaking clearly and at a normal volume, because part of what you're training is the physical coordination of your mouth, tongue, and breath, and that coordination only develops properly when you're producing real, full-volume speech, not a half-hearted whisper. Let me walk you through what an actual 15-minute speaking session might look like in practice, so this doesn't stay abstract. You'd start with 5 minutes of shadowing, picking a short clip from a podcast or show, playing it, speaking along with it in real time, then replaying that same short clip 4 or 5 times before moving to a new one. Then you'd spend 5 minutes on self-narration, describing whatever you're doing in that moment, out loud, in full sentences. And you'd finish with a 5-minute recorded monologue on a random topic, maybe something you saw in the news, or a plan you have for the weekend. Speaking continuously even through the awkward pauses, and saving the recording for later review. One thing worth mentioning here, many solo learners worry that speaking to an empty room, with no one correcting them, means they'll just practice their mistakes and reinforce bad habits. This concern is understandable, but it's largely overstated. The physical act of producing speech. Retrieving words quickly, constructing sentences under time pressure, training your mouth to move through unfamiliar sounds builds a foundation that's genuinely difficult to build any other way, and combining it with the writing and reading techniques we'll cover shortly gives you plenty of opportunity to catch and correct specific errors. Speaking practice builds fluency and automaticity, the other pillars help refine accuracy. You need both, and neither one alone is enough. Listening practice, turning passive input into active training. Now let's talk about listening, because most people already do a version of this, but in a way that's far weaker than it could be. Simply playing a podcast in the background while doing chores counts as exposure, but it's not active listening practice, and the difference matters a lot. Technique 1: Dictation practice. Find a short audio clip, ideally 30 seconds to a minute long, and try to write down exactly what you hear, word for word, pausing and replaying as many times as needed. Then compare what you wrote against a transcript or subtitles. This forces you to listen at a level of precision that casual listening never requires, and it will very quickly reveal specific sounds, contractions, and connected speech patterns that you've been mishearing or missing entirely, often without even realizing it. Technique 2: The 3-pass listening method. Listen to a short clip 3 separate times, but with a different goal each time. On the first pass, just listen for the general gist, what's this about, broadly speaking. On the second pass, listen for specific details, names, numbers, key facts. On the third pass, listen specifically for language, interesting phrases, grammar structures, vocabulary you didn't know. This structured, layered approach extracts far more value from a single short clip than casually listening to it once and moving on. Technique 3: Listen and predict. Pause an audio or video clip partway through a sentence, and try to predict how it's going to end, based on the context and grammar so far. Then unpause and check whether you were right. This trains a genuinely important listening skill, anticipating structure and meaning in real time. Which is exactly what skilled listeners do unconsciously when they follow fast native speech without falling behind. Technique 4: Accent and speed variation. Deliberately expose yourself to a range of accents and speaking speeds, rather than sticking exclusively to slow, clearly enunciated learner content. Real English comes from people with different regional accents, different speaking speeds, and different levels of formality, and if you only ever train on one narrow type of audio, you'll struggle badly the moment you encounter anything outside that narrow range. Mix in native speed podcasts, interviews, and casual conversations, alongside slower, learner-friendly material. Technique 5: Listening for connected speech. Native English speakers don't pronounce words the way they're written, sounds blend, disappear, or merge together in ways that textbooks rarely explain. Going to becomes gonna, want to becomes wanna, did you become something closer to did ya? Actively listen for these patterns and note them down when you catch them. Understanding connected speech is often the single biggest gap between learners who can read English well but struggle badly to understand native speakers talking at a normal pace. The overall principle across all of these listening techniques is the same one that applies to speaking: passive exposure builds some familiarity, but active, effortful engagement with what you're hearing builds real skill noticeably faster and far more reliably. It's worth mentioning that you don't need to abandon your passive listening habits entirely. Listening to a podcast while cooking or commuting still has value, and there's nothing wrong with enjoying English content casually. The point isn't to eliminate passive exposure, it's to make sure it's not the only thing you're doing. If 90% of your listening practice is passive background noise and only 10% is active, focused engagement like dictation or the 3-pass method, your listening skill will improve far more slowly than it could. A healthier balance flips that ratio, or at least brings the two closer to even, so that both familiarity and precision are being trained side by side. Reading practice, getting more than just comprehension. Reading is probably the easiest of the 4 pillars to do consistently, since most people already read something in English regularly. But most reading practice stops at basic comprehension. You read something, you understand roughly what it says, and you move on without extracting nearly as much value as you could. Technique 1: Extensive reading for volume. Read a large amount of material that's slightly below your challenge level, meaning you understand the vast majority of it without needing a dictionary constantly. This builds reading speed, reinforces vocabulary and grammar patterns through sheer repeated exposure, and keeps the process enjoyable enough that you'll actually want to keep doing it. Books, articles, or blog posts on topics you're genuinely interested in work best here, because interest keeps you reading consistently, which matters more than any single clever technique. Technique 2: Intensive reading for depth. Separately from your extensive reading, spend some sessions reading much more slowly and carefully, on shorter, denser pieces of text, a single paragraph or a short article where you stop at every unfamiliar word or structure, look it up, and really understand exactly how it's being used. This is a completely different mode from extensive reading, and both are necessary. Extensive reading builds fluency and speed, intensive reading builds precision and depth. Technique 3: Read aloud, don't just read silently. Take a short passage and read it out loud, at a natural pace, paying attention to your pronunciation and rhythm as you go. This bridges reading practice directly into speaking practice, and it's one of the most underused techniques among solo learners, because reading silently feels easier and faster, even though reading aloud extracts significantly more value for your spoken fluency. Technique 4: Sentence mining. As you read, actively collect sentences you find useful or interesting, not just individual words, but full sentences that show you how a word, phrase, or structure is actually used in context. Keep these in a notebook or a simple document. This is far more useful than a list of isolated vocabulary words, because a full sentence gives you the grammar, the natural word order, and the context all at once, ready to be reused directly in your own speaking or writing later. Technique 5: Rereading with a different lens. Take something you've already read once for general understanding, and read it a second time specifically hunting for grammar patterns. How are questions formed here? How is the past tense being used? What kind of connecting words are showing up between ideas? This second pass, focused purely on structure rather than meaning, trains a completely different skill than your first read-through did. Writing practice, seeing your own mistakes clearly. Writing is arguably the most underrated pillar among solo learners, because speaking happens fast and disappears the moment you say it, but writing sits still on the page, letting you actually see your own patterns and mistakes in a way that spoken practice never allows. Technique 1: Daily journaling. Write a few sentences to a paragraph every day about your day, your thoughts, or anything on your mind. Don't worry about perfection. The goal is consistency and volume over time. After a few weeks, go back and read your earliest entries. You'll very quickly start noticing recurring mistakes. Maybe you consistently mix up prepositions, or you keep using the wrong verb tense in certain situations, patterns that are almost impossible to notice when you're speaking in the moment, but become obvious once they're sitting still on a page in front of you. Technique 2: Translate and back-translate. Take a short passage in your native language, translate it into English as best you can, and set it aside. A day or two later, without looking at your English version, translate your English text back into your native language. Then compare that back translation to the original. Any meaning that got lost or distorted along the way usually points directly to a specific gap in your English, a word you don't quite know, or a structure you're not using correctly. Technique 3. Rewrite what you've read. After reading an article or short story, close it, and try to summarize or rewrite it from memory in your own words. This forces you to actively recall and reconstruct vocabulary and structures you just encountered, rather than passively recognizing them on the page, which is a far weaker form of learning. Technique 4. Self-correction with a delay. Write something, then set it aside for a day or two before reviewing it yourself. With that gap in time, you'll read your own writing with much fresher, more objective eyes, and you'll catch mistakes you would have completely missed if you'd reviewed it immediately after writing. Technique 5. Use free tools to check your writing, then study the corrections. There are free grammar checking tools you can run your writing through. The key here isn't just accepting the correction and moving on. It's stopping to understand exactly why the correction was made, so the underlying rule actually sticks in your memory instead of just getting silently fixed and forgotten. Overcoming the awkwardness of practicing alone. Before we move into vocabulary, I want to address something that stops a lot of people before they even get started: the sheer awkwardness of talking to yourself, recording your own voice, or narrating your actions out loud. If this feeling has been holding you back, you're far from alone, and it's worth taking a moment to work through it properly, because it's genuinely one of the biggest hidden barriers in solo practice. First, understand that this discomfort fades with repetition, almost without exception. The first time you record a monologue, or narrate yourself making coffee, it will probably feel ridiculous. By the 10th time, it barely registers. By the 50th time, it feels completely normal, maybe even enjoyable. This is simply how unfamiliar behaviors work. The awkwardness is temporary, but the skill you're building from pushing through it is permanent. Second, find a private, low-stakes environment for your first few sessions. A closed room, a car with the windows up, a walk somewhere quiet, anywhere you're confident no one can overhear you clearly. Removing the fear of being overheard early on makes it far easier to commit fully to speaking at a normal, natural volume, which, as we discussed earlier, matters quite a bit for the physical training aspect of this practice. Third, reframe what listening to your own recordings actually means. Many learners avoid replaying their own voice because it feels uncomfortable or embarrassing to hear their mistakes. But this discomfort is exactly the same discomfort an athlete feels reviewing footage of a missed shot, or a musician feels listening back to an off-key note during practice. It's not a sign that something is wrong with you, it's simply what improvement looks like from the inside, in every skill, not just language learning. Fourth, remember that nobody is grading this. There's no teacher assigning a score to your monologue, no classmates silently judging your pronunciation. The entire point of solo practice is that the stakes are genuinely as low as they'll ever be, which makes it the safest possible environment to make mistakes, sound strange, and figure things out through trial and error, without any real consequence attached. If the awkwardness still feels like a serious barrier even after trying these approaches, start smaller than you think you need to. Instead of a full 1-minute monologue, start with a single sentence, spoken out loud, once a day. Build the habit at that tiny scale first, and expand the duration only once speaking out loud alone no longer feels like a big event. Small, consistent starts beat ambitious plans that collapse under their own weight within the first week. Building vocabulary the right way, alone. Vocabulary deserves its own short section, because most solo learners approach it the same ineffective way: long lists of isolated words with translations, memorized and quickly forgotten. Instead, always try to learn new vocabulary attached to a full sentence or phrase, not as a standalone word. A word learned in isolation has almost no context to help you remember it or use it correctly later, while a word learned inside a natural sentence comes with built-in grammar, natural word order, and context, all of which massively improve both memory and usability. Also, prioritize high-frequency, flexible vocabulary over obscure or highly specific words. A relatively small set of common words and phrases covers the overwhelming majority of everyday conversation, so mastering those deeply will improve your actual fluency far more than memorizing rare words you'll rarely have the chance to use. Finally, revisit vocabulary you've learned at increasing intervals, a technique often called spaced repetition. Reviewing a word the next day, then a few days later, then a week later, then a month later, builds far stronger long-term memory than reviewing it intensely once and never coming back to it. Common mistakes solo learners make. Let's go through the mistakes that quietly derail most people who try to practice English alone, so you can recognize and avoid them. Mistake 1: consuming instead of producing. As we covered earlier, watching and listening passively feels productive but builds a very different skill than speaking and writing do. Make sure your routine includes real production, every single week, not just input. Mistake 2: studying only what feels comfortable. It's tempting to keep reading topics you already know well and listening to speakers whose accent you find easy to understand. But real growth happens at the edge of your comfort zone, so deliberately include material that challenges you, not just material that feels easy and pleasant. Mistake 3: no structure or plan. Studying randomly, whenever you feel like it, on whatever topic happens to catch your attention, leads to inconsistent, patchy progress. A simple weekly structure, even a loose one, dramatically outperforms unstructured, mood-based studying. Mistake 4: never reviewing old material. New input constantly gets prioritized over reviewing what you've already learned, and as a result, vocabulary and structures you technically covered months ago quietly fade from memory. Build review into your routine, not just new material. Mistake 5: perfectionism that prevents production. Many solo learners refuse to speak or write until they feel ready, which usually means never, because that feeling of readiness doesn't arrive through more input, it arrives through the uncomfortable process of producing the language imperfectly, again and again, until it improves. Mistake 6: no way of measuring progress. Without any kind of recording, journal, or benchmark to look back on, it's very easy to feel like you're not improving at all, even when you actually are, simply because day-to-day change is too small to notice. This leads many people to quit right before they would have started seeing real results. Mistake 7: treating grammar study as an end in itself. Understanding a grammar rule intellectually and being able to actually use it correctly and automatically in real speech are two very different levels of mastery. Grammar study is useful, but only when it's immediately connected to actual production practice, not studied in isolation as a purely academic exercise. Building a weekly routine that actually sticks. Now let's put all of this together into something practical, an actual weekly structure you can follow, rather than just a loose collection of techniques. The key principle here is balance across all 4 pillars, without requiring hours of free time every single day. Here's a sample structure you can adapt to your own schedule and needs. Monday, speaking focus. 10 minutes of shadowing using a short audio clip, followed by a 1-minute monologue on any topic, recorded so you can review it later. Tuesday, listening focus. 1 dictation exercise using a 30-second clip, followed by the 3-pass listening method on a slightly longer piece of audio, maybe 2 to 3 minutes long. Wednesday, reading and vocabulary. 20 to 30 minutes of extensive reading on a topic you enjoy, plus sentence mining. Collecting 3 to 5 useful sentences from what you read. Thursday, writing focus. A daily journal entry, plus reviewing and correcting a journal entry from about a week earlier, checking whether you notice the same mistakes repeating themselves. Friday, speaking focus again. Role-play both sides of a common conversation scenario, plus self-narration throughout the day whenever you remember to do it. Saturday, mixed review. Revisit vocabulary and sentences collected earlier in the week using spaced repetition, and listen back to one of your recorded voice memos or monologues from the past week or two. Sunday, light and flexible. Consume something purely for enjoyment, a show, a podcast, a book, with no formal exercise attached. Rest matters too, and this also keeps the whole process sustainable and enjoyable long-term, rather than feeling like an endless grind. You don't need to follow this exact structure rigidly. What matters far more than the specific schedule is the underlying principle, touching all 4 pillars regularly throughout the week, rather than obsessing over just one and neglecting the others. Even 15 to 20 minutes a day, structured this way, will produce far more real improvement than 2 unfocused hours of passive content consumption. Tools and resources that actually help. You genuinely don't need expensive courses to practice effectively alone, but a few simple tools can make the process significantly smoother. A basic voice recorder, which is already built into virtually every smartphone, is essential for your monologues, voice memos, and shadowing practice, since reviewing your own recordings over time is one of the most powerful ways to actually see your progress. A simple notebook or document for sentence mining and journaling costs nothing and works perfectly well. There's no need for anything fancy or complicated here. Free grammar checking tools are useful for the writing correction step, as long as you remember to actually study why each correction was made, rather than just accepting it and moving on without understanding the underlying rule. Podcasts and video content aimed at native speakers, not just learner-specific content, are important once you're past a beginner level, since learner-focused audio is usually far slower and clearer than real, natural speech, and you need exposure to both. And finally, free language exchange platforms, while not strictly practicing alone, can be an excellent occasional supplement to a mostly solo routine, giving you real conversational practice without any cost, whenever you want a bit of live interaction to complement everything else you're doing on your own. How to actually measure your progress. One of the hardest parts of practicing alone is knowing whether it's actually working, since there's no teacher grading you and no test scheduled on the calendar. Here are a few reliable ways to track your own progress over time. Compare recordings over time. Since you're already recording monologues and voice memos as part of your speaking practice, go back every month or so and compare a recent recording to one from a month or two earlier. The difference in fluency, hesitation, and natural rhythm is usually very noticeable once you have that direct side-by-side comparison, even when day-to-day progress feels invisible. Track your dictation accuracy. If you regularly do dictation exercises, keep a rough record of how accurately you're transcribing what you hear over time. Improved accuracy on similarly challenging material is a clear, objective sign that your listening skill is genuinely improving. Notice your journal patterns changing. Read back through several weeks or months of journal entries at once, and pay attention to whether certain mistakes that used to appear constantly have started disappearing, or whether your sentences have naturally gotten longer and more complex without you consciously trying to make them so. Pay attention to hesitation and pause length. During your monologues and self-narration, notice whether the pauses where you're searching for a word or struggling with a structure are getting shorter and less frequent over time. This is a direct, felt indicator of increasing automaticity, exactly the kind of fluency that isolated vocabulary memorization can never build on its own. Set specific, small milestones rather than a vague goal of fluency. Instead of aiming for the enormous, undefined target of becoming fluent, set concrete milestones, speaking for 3 minutes without a long pause, reading a full article without needing to look up more than a couple of words, writing a journal entry with noticeably fewer grammar mistakes than a month before. These smaller milestones are far easier to track, and hitting them regularly keeps motivation high. Staying motivated without a teacher or classroom. Solo learning has one major weakness that classroom learning doesn't: there's no external structure forcing you to show up. No scheduled class, no teacher checking your homework, no classmates seeing you skip a week. This means motivation and consistency become entirely your own responsibility, and that's genuinely difficult to sustain for most people over the long run. A few strategies help significantly here. First, tie your practice to an existing daily habit, the same way you might tie any new routine to something you already do automatically right after breakfast, right before bed, during your commute. Attaching new practice to an already automatic habit makes it far more likely to actually stick. Second, make your progress visible to yourself. A simple calendar where you mark off each day you practiced, or a running folder of your recordings and journal entries, gives you something concrete to look back on, which matters enormously on the days when motivation is low and it doesn't feel like anything is happening. Third, connect your practice to genuine interest whenever possible. If you love a particular show, hobby, or topic, use English content related to that interest as part of your practice material. Interest sustains consistency far more reliably than pure discipline alone, especially over months and years rather than just weeks. Fourth, accept that some days will be low-effort days, and that's completely fine. A 5-minute session on a tired, unmotivated day is still infinitely better than skipping entirely, and it keeps your streak and your habit intact, which matters more for long-term consistency than any single high-effort session ever will. And finally, remind yourself regularly why you started. Whether it's a career goal, travel, connecting with people, or simply personal achievement, reconnecting with your actual reason for learning helps you push through the inevitable plateaus where progress feels slow or invisible, even though it's still quietly happening underneath the surface. Frequently asked questions about solo practice. Let's quickly cover a few questions that tend to come up constantly when people start building a solo practice routine like this one. How long before I stop feeling awkward talking to myself? For most people, the sharpest discomfort fades within the first 1 to 2 weeks of consistent practice, and it becomes close to unnoticeable somewhere around the 1-month mark. The key word there is consistent. Sporadic practice, where you go back to talking to yourself after a 2-week gap, tends to reset that discomfort each time, while daily or near-daily practice lets it fade steadily and permanently. What if I don't have 30 minutes a day to dedicate to this? That's completely fine, and honestly, 30 minutes was never a strict requirement. Even 10 to 15 minutes a day, done consistently and touching a mix of the 4 pillars across the week, will produce real, measurable results over a few months. Consistency at a smaller scale reliably beats an ambitious plan you can't actually sustain. Should I focus more on American English or British English, or does it matter? For solo practice purposes, it matters far less than most people assume. Pick whichever accent and vocabulary set you're personally drawn to or need for a specific goal, and stay reasonably consistent with it early on, mainly so you're not confusing yourself by mixing conflicting pronunciation patterns while you're still building automaticity. Once your fluency is stronger, exposure to multiple accents becomes a genuine strength rather than a source of confusion. Is it bad to rely on subtitles while watching shows for listening practice? Subtitles aren't inherently bad, but they change what skill you're actually training. Reading subtitles while listening trains reading speed and reinforces vocabulary recognition, but it lets your ear rely on the text instead of doing the harder work of parsing sound on its own. Try alternating, watch some sessions with subtitles off entirely, accepting that you'll understand less at first, specifically to force your listening skill to do the heavier lifting. How do I know if I'm actually plateauing, or just not noticing my own progress? True plateaus are less common than they feel, especially in the first year of consistent practice. Most of the time, what feels like a plateau is simply progress that's too gradual to notice day to day. This is exactly why the progress tracking methods covered earlier in this video matter so much. Comparing recordings or journal entries from a month or two apart will almost always reveal real movement, even during periods that felt completely stagnant while you were living through them. Putting it all together, a realistic timeline. Let's talk honestly about what kind of timeline you can realistically expect if you follow a structured solo practice routine like the one outlined in this video. In the first few weeks, the changes will be subtle and easy to miss day to day. You'll likely notice small things, a word coming to mind slightly faster than before, catching a sentence in a podcast that you would have missed a month earlier. These small signals matter, even though they don't feel dramatic yet. By 1 to 2 months in, if you're consistently touching all 4 pillars each week, you should start noticing clearer improvements, shorter hesitation pauses in your monologues, noticeably fewer recurring mistakes in your journal entries, and an easier time following native speed audio that used to feel overwhelming. By 3 to 4 months, with consistent practice, most people notice a real, undeniable shift in their spoken fluency, specifically sentences forming faster, less mental translation happening in the background, and a growing sense of comfort producing English on the spot, rather than needing to plan every sentence carefully before speaking it. Beyond that point, progress becomes less about needing new techniques and more about simply maintaining consistency, gradually increasing the difficulty of your material, and continuing to push yourself slightly past your comfort zone in every session, the same way it worked from the very beginning. The most important thing to understand about this timeline is that it depends far more on consistency than on intensity. Someone who practices with real focus for 20 minutes a day, every day, will consistently outperform someone who does an occasional 3-hour marathon session once every couple of weeks, even though the total hours might look similar on paper. Frequency and consistency build automaticity in a way that occasional intense bursts simply cannot replicate. Key takeaways before the closing. Before wrapping up, let me pull together the most important points from everything we've covered. Practicing alone only works when it involves genuine production, not just passive consumption. Watching, listening, and reading build real value, but only when they're balanced with speaking and writing, where you're actually forced to retrieve and produce the language yourself. Structure beats randomness. A simple weekly plan touching all 4 pillars. Speaking, listening, reading, and writing will consistently outperform unstructured studying, even if the unstructured studying involves more total hours. Discomfort is a sign of real learning, not a sign you're doing something wrong. The awkwardness of talking to yourself, the frustration of a difficult dictation exercise, the sting of noticing a mistake you've been repeating for months, these uncomfortable moments are exactly where genuine skill building happens. And finally, measurable progress matters enormously for staying motivated over the long term. Recordings, journal entries, and small concrete milestones give you real, undeniable evidence of growth, especially on the days when progress feels invisible and it would be easy to convince yourself that nothing is working. Recap and closing. Let's bring this all together one final time. Practicing English alone absolutely can work, and it can work extremely well, but only if you understand the real difference between passive consumption and active production, and structure your time accordingly. Watching shows and listening to podcasts builds valuable exposure, but real fluency requires you to speak, write, and actively retrieve the language yourself, over and over, even when it feels uncomfortable and imperfect at first. Use shadowing, self-narration, monologues, and role-play to train your speaking without needing a partner. Use dictation, layered listening passes, and exposure to varied accents and speeds to train your ear beyond simple comprehension. Use extensive and intensive reading, along with sentence mining, to build both fluency and precision. And use daily journaling, translation exercises, and delayed self-correction to catch mistakes you'd never notice while speaking in the moment. Build all of this into a simple, realistic weekly routine. Track your progress with recordings and concrete milestones rather than a vague feeling of fluency, and stay consistent even on low-energy days, because frequency matters far more than occasional intensity. You don't need a classroom, and you don't need to spend money on expensive courses to make real progress. You need structure, honest production instead of passive consumption, and consistency over time. That's genuinely the whole system. If this video helped you, share it with someone you know who's trying to learn English on their own and might be stuck in the same passive consumption trap so many self-learners fall into. And let me know in the comments, which of these techniques are you going to start with tonight? See you in the next video.